Stephanie Lynn Nicks was born on May 26, 1948, in Phoenix, Arizona. Because her father, Jess Nicks, was a vice president at Greyhound, the family moved constantly, never staying in one place for long. As a result, the strongest influences in Stephanie's early life came from within her own home. Her mother, Barbara, often kept her close and entertained her with improvised fairy tales filled with imagination and wonder. Without realizing it, Barbara was teaching her daughter how to treat words like poetry, spinning stories of witches, heroines, and mythical journeys, images that would later become the emotional core of Stevie Nicks' lyrical world. Her grandfather, Aaron Jess, was just as influential. Though he never achieved fame as a country singer, he poured that unrealized dream into his granddaughter and encouraged her musical path from the very beginning. When Stephanie was 4 years old, he built her a small guitar by hand and taught her how to play. By the time she was 5, he was already taking her to sing alongside him in bars, gin mills, and factories. Perhaps the most intriguing detail of her childhood, however, is that Stevie unknowingly shaped her future identity by accident. As a young child, she struggled to pronounce the name Stephanie, turning it into Stevie, a simple mispronunciation that would become her lifelong name and legend. The nickname stayed, quietly becoming part of who she was. As Stevie grew older, the influence of her family never disappeared. Everyone around her sensed something special and did their best to encourage it. In 5th grade, her grandfather took that support to another level, buying what she later described as an entire truckload of records, filling her world with sound. Listening to music day after day slowly pulled her toward writing, first as poetry rather than songs. Her first true composition didn't arrive until she was 16. "I've loved and I've lost and I'm sad but not blue," written after her parents gave her a Goya guitar for her birthday. Even then, Stevie wasn't imagining a life defined by fame or a music career. Following her father's advice, she aimed for stability, treating music as a passion rather than a future. Her school years were unsettled, marked by constant moves. She briefly joined a folk rock group called Changing Times, only to leave a few months later when the family relocated once again. Everything finally shifted in the mid-1960s, when the Nicks family put down roots in California, a move that would quietly change everything. This moment marked a true turning point for Stevie. At Menlo Atherton High School, she met Lindsey Buckingham, a meeting that would later feel almost mythical in her story. At a school party, Lindsey was singing California Dreaming by the Mamas and the Papas when Stevie simply walked over and began harmonizing with him, effortlessly and without hesitation. On the surface, they could not have been more different. Lindsey was introverted, intensely focused on music, while Stevie was open, emotional, and poetic. Yet that night created a bond that first became friendship and eventually turned into romance. More importantly, meeting Lindsey quietly set Stevie's musical journey in motion, even though she didn't recognize its significance at the time. Buckingham was already part of a psychedelic rock band called Fritz, and when several members left in 1967, he invited Stevie to step in as the lead vocalist. Still, she continued to treat music as something secondary, enrolling at San Jose State College with a clear plan to become an English teacher. Everything shifted between 1968 and 1970, however, when Fritz began opening for major acts like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. Standing before those massive audiences, Stevie was completely captivated by the energy of the stage. From that moment on, she knew with certainty that she wanted to be an artist. Her father, disappointed at first, eventually gave his blessing. Stevie left college behind and stepped into what would become the most demanding, yet most defining period of her life. Everything began with a kind of romantic certainty after Fritz dissolved in 1972. Stevie and Lindsey believed they didn't need a band anymore, just each other. Fueled by that belief, they threw themselves into a life built on passion and persistence. By day, Stevie worked long hours as a waitress. By night, she emptied her emotions onto the page, while Lindsey disappeared into guitars, tape machines, and sound. Riding on the reputation they had earned with Fritz, the two secured a record deal with Polydor Records. In 1973, they released their debut album, Buckingham Nicks. Sonically, the record felt polished and modern. The harmonies were precise, the arrangements carefully layered. But what truly set it apart were Stevie's lyrics. Songs like Crystal, Races Are Run, and Long Distance Winner avoided simple pop cliches. Instead, they explored inner conflict, symbolism, and almost mythic imagery, fragments of a private journal transformed into music. Still, the world barely noticed. Polydor offered little promotion, radio stations gave the album minimal airplay, and critics paid only fleeting attention. Sales were disappointing, and within months, the label dropped them. For two young artists, the blow was crushing. What had felt like the beginning of a career quickly became a fight to survive. Lindsey fell ill with mononucleosis, and Stevie pushed herself to exhaustion, working non-stop just to keep them afloat. Trying to survive and hold on to whatever strength she had left, Stevie began experimenting with drugs. Money troubles only deepened the cracks in their relationship, especially after Lindsey took a paying job as a guitarist for the Everly Brothers, leaving Stevie to shoulder the weight of their shared dream almost alone. Still, she did what she knew best. She turned hardship into music. After exhausting shifts at work, she somehow found the energy to write late into the night. From those moments came Rhiannon, inspired by a Welsh goddess she discovered in a novel by Mary Leader. The name haunted her. She repeated it over and over, as if it were calling to her from another realm. Around the same time, she wrote Landslide, a fragile confession of doubt born from a conversation with her father in Aspen, when she quietly asked herself whether she should abandon music and settle for a safer life. Just as Stevie and Lindsey seemed close to losing not only their creative partnership but their relationship entirely, fate stepped in. In 1974, Mick Fleetwood was searching for a new guitarist for Fleetwood Mac. After hearing Frozen Love from Buckingham Nicks, he was stunned by Lindsey's playing and invited him to join the band. Lindsey agreed, but only on one condition: Stevie had to come with him. So in January 1975, they both walked into Fleetwood Mac. For Stevie, it was a defining moment. One day she was barely getting by, the next she was rehearsing with one of Britain's most respected blues rock bands. Everything happened quickly. That same year, Fleetwood Mac released their self-titled album, a complete rebirth for the band, and the true beginning of her legend. Stevie soon experienced her own moment of arrival. Her song Rhiannon erupted into an anthem, hypnotic and mysterious, described by rock writers as less a song than a spell. On stage, Stevie became someone else entirely. Flowing shawls, lace, hands moving like rituals in the air. That was when the image of the White Witch was born. Her second major contribution, Landslide, reached even deeper. It wasn't simply a ballad, it was a confession, and audiences heard their own doubts reflected in it. By 1976, the band was accelerating toward superstardom. Touring across America gave Stevie her first true taste of rock and roll life: hotels, arenas, deafening crowds. But success always demands a price. Behind the curtain, tensions were building, tensions that would spill directly into the creation of Rumours. Released in February 1977, the album was born out of emotional wreckage. By the time recording began, Fleetwood Mac was barely functioning as a group of friends. Stevie and Lindsey, crushed by fame and rivalry, had ended their relationship, leaving behind a volatile mix of pain, jealousy, and barely concealed resentment. John and Christine McVie were divorcing. Mick Fleetwood's own marriage was collapsing. The chaos soaked into the music, giving the album its raw, exposed power, every track a wounded confession wrapped in melody. Stevie's role in Rumours was essential. She brought Dreams, the only Fleetwood Mac song ever to reach #1 on the Billboard charts. Its creation feels almost mythic. Stevie wrote it in a single day, alone in a small studio room with nothing but a keyboard and a bed. "I sat down, turned on the tape recorder, and the song just poured out of me," she later said. Her lyrics answered Lindsey's "Go Your Own Way" directly, a song that laid their breakup bare with cutting honesty. In Dreams, Stevie chose a quieter tone, but her resolve was just as firm. "Thunder Only Happens When It's Raining" sounded less like a lyric and more like acceptance, a calm truth spoken in the middle of emotional wreckage. The song became a voice of feminine clarity, standing steady amid the chaos surrounding her. Just as powerful was Gold Dust Woman, a dark, mystical track critics later called an anthem of the 1970s unraveling. Stevie sang of a woman drifting through fame, drugs, and shattered illusions. It felt both confessional and prophetic, suggesting that her fall was far from over. After the overwhelming success of Rumours, the band faced an impossible challenge. How do you follow something that had already become legend? The answer arrived in 1979 with Tusk, a bold, experimental gamble that cost over $1 million, an unheard-of sum at the time. Like before, it was created in an atmosphere of tension. Lindsey pushed the group toward the avant-garde, drawing inspiration from punk and new wave, while Stevie brought songs steeped in mysticism and raw emotion. Her defining moment was Sarah, a nearly 6-minute ballad that became the album's emotional core and her most intimate confession. It spoke of lost love, her friend Sarah Wrecker, and of Stevie herself, who was quietly grieving a private abortion. The song unfolded like a whispered cry, sealing her reputation as a writer who turned deeply personal pain into timeless, universal anthems. The Tusk World Tour matched the album's scale, 113 shows across the world, played to millions. Yet behind the spectacle, the same fractures remained. Alcohol and drugs filled the gaps where communication once lived. By this point, Stevie and Lindsey's relationship had become a quiet war. They performed together on stage, but off-stage they barely spoke. Stevie later described this period as living inside an enchanted haze, where reality and performance blurred into one. When the tour finally ended, she was completely drained. The constant tension made one thing clear: she needed space to breathe. That realization led her toward a solo project, and in the summer of 1981, Bella Donna was released. It was an immediate triumph. The album went straight to #1 on the Billboard charts, proving that Stevie could command the spotlight entirely on her own. Bella Donna was filled with defining moments. Her duet with Tom Petty, "Stop Draggin' My Heart Around," became one of her signature hits. "Edge of 17," fierce and almost mystical, emerged as a personal anthem, written in the shadow of John Lennon's death and the loss of her uncle, transforming grief into the image of a white-winged dove. "Leather and Lace," recorded with Don Henley of the Eagles, revealed a softer, more intimate side of her songwriting. With this album, Stevie Nicks became the first woman in rock to stand at the top both as part of a legendary band and as a solo artist. In 1982, Fleetwood Mac returned with Mirage, a brighter, more melodic record. After the bold experiments of Tusk, Stevie once again took center stage. Her song Gypsy became a hit and one of her most autobiographical works, reaching back to her early, struggling years before fame, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, wearing second-hand dresses, dreaming freely. Beneath the success, however, there was a quiet ache. Even as her fame grew, Stevie was already mourning the woman she used to be. And as she shifted her focus back to her solo career, alone with herself, her dependencies began to deepen. After the triumph of Bella Donna, Stevie released her second solo album, The Wild Heart, and erased any doubt that her success was accidental. The record surged up the charts, with singles like If Anyone Falls and especially Stand Back sealing her status as the dominant female force in rock. The origin of Stand Back quickly became part of her legend. Stevie wrote the song on the very day she married Kim Anderson. Inspired by Prince's Little Red Corvette, she called Prince directly, and he showed up at the studio to play synthesizer on the track. The result was a song that radiated independence and fire, proof of her rare ability to turn intensely personal moments into music that filled arenas. The Wild Heart Tour cemented her image as a rock goddess. On stage, she was more than a performer. Flowing lace, trailing shawls, and ritual-like movements transformed each show into something mystical. Fans didn't just come to hear songs, they came for the spell. Behind the scenes, however, drugs were her constant companion. While audiences saw boundless energy, Stevie was quietly burning herself out. Her personal life, already fragile after her breakup with Lindsey, slipped further into chaos. In 1983, she made a painful and confusing decision, marrying Kim Anderson, the widower of her closest friend Robin, who had died of leukemia and left behind a newborn son. Consumed by grief and responsibility, Stevie convinced herself it was the right thing to do. The marriage lasted only 3 months. She later called it madness, a desperate attempt to numb unbearable pain. By the mid-1980s, as she worked on Rock a Little, Stevie was sinking deeper into turmoil. Recording stretched on for 2 years, costing millions, as her mental state made finishing songs nearly impossible. She would spend hours obsessing over tiny details, sometimes unable to remember what had been recorded the day before. Released in 1985, the album still went platinum and produced hits like Talk to Me and I Can't Wait. Yet critics sensed a change. Her voice sounded worn, the lyrics less focused. Though the tour succeeded, Stevie later admitted she lived in a constant state of exhaustion. Doctors had already begun warning her, if she didn't stop, her heart might not survive. The damage to her nasal septum had become so severe that every use of cocaine carried the risk of sudden death. That reality pushed Stevie into rehab for the first time, with the clear understanding that if she wanted to keep singing, she had to escape drugs. But recovery led her into a different kind of prison. Doctors prescribed the tranquilizer Klonopin, a medication she would later describe as her most dangerous addiction. It bound her quietly for years. In the mid-1980s, Fleetwood Mac began work on what was meant to be a triumphant return, Tango in the Night. Musically, it delivered, sleek, polished, modern, packed with songs perfectly tailored to the late 80s sound. Inside the band, however, tension was reaching a breaking point. Lindsey Buckingham assumed near-total control of production, turning the studio into an obsessive laboratory, endlessly refining tracks and pushing everyone to their limits. Stevie, meanwhile, was barely able to function, let alone create. Her role on the album was limited, but meaningful. 7 Wonders became her signature contribution, modest in origin, powerful in impact. Though written by songwriter Sandy Stewart, Stevie transformed 7 Wonders through her voice and imagery, turning it into one of the album's defining moments. Her other song, Welcome to the Room, Sarah, was even more personal, a near confession inspired by her time in rehab, about a woman stepping into a room and searching for her way back to life. It wasn't a hit, but it was honest. Released in the spring of 1987, Tango in the Night was a massive success, becoming one of Fleetwood Mac's best-selling albums. Beneath its glossy surface, however, the band was unraveling. After the release, Buckingham refused to tour, exhausted and determined to focus on his solo career. His departure hit Stevie hard. Their romance was long over, but musically, he was still her other half. Now she had to face the stage without him, carrying the weight of Fleetwood Mac's legacy with a new lineup. The Tango in the Night tour moved forward, and for the audience, it felt like magic, even as everything behind the scenes was barely holding together. Sold-out stadiums, chart-topping singles, iconic music videos, the mystique never faded. But for Stevie, the reality was merciless. She still stepped on stage as the spellbinding White Witch, yet once the lights went down, she withdrew into pills and an increasingly fragile hold on herself. In 1989, she released her solo album The Other Side of the Mirror, inspired by Alice in Wonderland. Drawn to symbols and myth her entire life, Stevie used the idea of the mirror world as a reflection of her own existence. The single Rooms on Fire shimmered with brightness, but much of the album carried a heavier shadow, songs steeped in isolation, emotional distance, and a yearning for a time when music felt like rescue rather than obligation. Critics found the record uneven, yet fans recognized it as deeply personal, the sound of a woman suspended between reality and her inner world. By the late 1980s, her concerts still drew tens of thousands, but inside, she was unraveling. Stevie later admitted she felt trapped in her own body. Klonopin drained her strength, and years of substance abuse had taken a severe toll on her health. Her personal life lay in ruins. She said that when she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw a rock icon, only someone slowly being overtaken by her demons. By 1990, Stevie Nicks stood at a crossroads. On one side was her legacy. One of the most influential women in music, her White Witch image woven into popular culture, her songs embedded in millions of lives. On the other side was collapse. She had survived a decade of enormous success, yet nearly lost herself in the process. Fleetwood Mac, too, was faltering. In 1990, they released Behind the Mask. Without Lindsey Buckingham, The band's sound shifted noticeably. The album performed well in Britain but received a far cooler response in the United States. Stevie contributed tracks like Affairs of the Heart and Freedom, though critics noted that her voice no longer carried the same spark. The tour that followed was punishing. By its end, Stevie knew she could not continue. In 1991, she made the painful decision to leave Fleetwood Mac, stepping away from the band that had defined her legend. It was heartbreaking, but deep down, she understood it was the only way she could survive. That same year, Stevie released Timespace, the best of Stevie Nicks, a solo compilation that gathered her greatest hits alongside a few new songs. For fans, it was a reminder of how dominant her voice had been throughout the 1980s. For Stevie, it felt far less celebratory, more like an epitaph. She sensed her career slipping away. The mid-1990s marked her lowest point. In 1994, she released Street Angel, widely regarded as the weakest album in her catalog. The recording process was agonizing. Under the grip of Klonopin, she was unfocused, detached, and barely present. Later, she admitted she could hardly remember making the album at all. Critics were unconvinced, and even longtime fans could see something was wrong. Her once enchanting stage presence felt drained, her performances mechanical. Yet it was in this darkness that the seeds of rebirth were planted. By 1993, Stevie had realized that Klonopin was destroying her life. In 1994, she entered a clinic to detox. The process lasted nearly a year and a half, a daily fight just to think clearly. She later described it as crawling out of hell. But it saved her life. By the end of the decade, she was writing again, singing again, dreaming again. The true turning point came in 1997 with her return to Fleetwood Mac. The classic lineup, Nicks, Buckingham, Mick Fleetwood, John and Christine McVie, reunited for the dance. It wasn't just an album, it was a cultural event. The live record soared up the charts, and the tour became one of the most successful in the band's history. For Stevie, it felt like being reborn. Standing beside Lindsey once more, singing Landslide and Silver Springs with the same intensity as decades earlier, she felt the crowd rise with her. Silver Springs was especially unforgettable. Written years earlier about her breakup with Buckingham, she delivered it while staring straight at him. The wound was still open, the story still alive, and that raw honesty made the performance electric. By the year 2000, Stevie Nicks had survived the decade transformed. She had lost much, her health, years of creative momentum, even part of her voice. But she had reclaimed something greater, herself. As the new millennium began, Stevie occupied a familiar place for rock legends, revered, mythologized, and quietly underestimated. Many assumed her greatest work was behind her. She set out to prove otherwise. In 2001, she released Trouble in Shangri-La, an album she had labored over for years as her clarity and creative strength slowly returned. The songs were brutally honest, reflecting on fame's illusions, destructive passions, and the cost of carrying magic as an artist. Critics praised the record for its maturity, self-aware, reflective, yet still unmistakably mystical. Younger artists like Sheryl Crow and Sarah McLachlan appeared on the album, a clear sign that Stevie was now seen as a guide, someone who had walked through fire and lived to tell the story. Fleetwood Mac also returned in 2003 with Say You Will, their first album without Christine McVie. Stevie carried much of its emotional weight. Songs like Illume and Goodbye Baby felt like diary entries, reflections on grief, absence, and the quiet after upheaval. The tour that followed became a celebration. On stage, the unspoken tension between Stevie and Lindsey once again came alive. They no longer needed words. A single glance was enough. The fire was still there, no longer love, but something just as powerful, a creative, unbreakable bond. Having reclaimed her place as a solo artist capable of greatness, Stevie Nicks was still surprising the world, and she wasn't finished yet. Her album In Your Dreams, created with Dave Stewart of Eurythmics, felt like a quiet revelation. For the first time in years, Stevie opened her home and her creative process to the camera. The documentary that followed showed her fully alive again, inspired, playful, and still deeply romantic. Songs like Moonlight, A Vampire's Dream, and Italian Summer carried the same misty poetry that had defined her work in the 1970s, now shaped by the hard-earned wisdom of experience. In 2014, she released 24 Karat Gold, Songs from the Vault, a collection of older compositions that had never been officially recorded. Many dated back to the 70s and 80s, turning the album into a bridge between who she was and who she had become. Stevie proved that those early instincts and lyrics were just as powerful as her greatest classics. They had simply been lost in the storm of fame. For fans, it felt like discovering the young Stevie again, writing in hotel rooms and tour buses, now given new life through her mature voice. That same period saw Fleetwood Mac reunite once more in their classic lineup with the return of Christine McVie. The On With the Show tour from 2014 to 2015 was a triumph. Stadiums filled again, and Stevie, draped in timeless lace, sang Landslide as if the passing years had only deepened its meaning. For many, these concerts were more than performances. They were reunions with a soundtrack that had followed them through life. In 2019, Stevie Nicks was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, becoming the first woman ever honored twice, once for her solo career and once with Fleetwood Mac. The moment sealed her legacy not just as a singer, but as a cultural icon. She had fallen, risen, and proven that her magic was never a trend or an accident. It was timeless. Today, Stevie Nicks still performs, still fills arenas, and still carries an air of mystery. The chaos of addiction and destructive love no longer defines her life, but the stage continues to draw power from her presence. Known as the White Witch of Rock, she stands not just as a symbol, but as a woman who transformed pain into art, who lived several lives within one, and discovered that music could be more than enchantment for others. It could be salvation for herself.